electoral management expert from ECES, who would look at practical considerations to bear in mind when we are talking about out-of-country voting. And finally, we have Mr. Sky Christensen, who is the Chief Technical Advisor, UNDP Chief Technical Advisor in Moldova, who is going to do a little case study from Moldova. So without any further ado, I would pass the floor to Mr. Ibrahim Toure to lay set the stage. And Mr. Toure, you have 15 minutes.
Good morning. Good morning, Excellencies, Commissioners. Good morning, colleagues. And thank you, Mr. Moderator, for giving me the floor. So my name is Ibrahim Toure, as I was introduced earlier, and I'm a Senior Desk Officer with the Citizens and Diaspora Directorate at the African Union Commission. So in terms of setting the scene, so may I just first of all start with the African Union frames the diaspora engagement as both a socio-economic political objective and a component of continental integration. So within this framework, diaspora voting is often discussed not simply as an electoral issue, but as part of broader commitments to democratic participation, citizenship, and inclusion of Africans living outside the continent. So to buttress this point, Article 3Q of the Protocols on Amendments to the Constitutive Act of the African Union, for instance, establishes that one of the core objectives of the AU is to invite and encourage the full participation of African diaspora as an important part of the continent in building the African Union. So this automatically sets the stage for the inclusion of the diaspora in political processes across the continent. In 2003, the Republic of Senegal also proposed that the AU should consider having the diaspora as its sixth region, alongside North, South, East, West, and Central Africa. So this recognition reflects the understanding that Africans living outside the continent remain an integral members of the African community. In this regard, the AU encourages member states to develop policies that facilitate diaspora participation in governance, peace building, economic development, and regional integration. Also in 2005, the African Union defined the African diaspora as people of African origin living outside the continent, irrespective of their citizenship and nationality, who are willing to contribute to the development of the continent and building the African Union. So this recognition is intended to strengthen political, economic, and cultural ties between Africa and its global diaspora, encourage the diaspora participation in governance and development, promote inclusion in continental affairs, and facilitate mechanisms for consultation and representation. So CIDO, the Citizens and Diaspora Directorate, for its own part, continues to serve as the mandate holder or coordination hub for diaspora engagement across the African Union system, ensuring coherence between policy intent and implementation. In terms of member states' obligations and norms, the African Union's Constitutive Act commits member states to democratic principles, popular participation, good governance, and respect for human rights. While it does not expressly mention external voting, it emphasizes on participation, provides an overarching normative basis for considering the political rights of citizens abroad. Yeah. Okay, no problem. Yes. Okay. The moderator had warned me about time, so that's why, but I'll do my best to slow down, yeah. So beyond legal instruments, AU policy documents consistently encourage member states to recognize the diaspora as strategic partners in continental development, establish institutional mechanisms for diaspora engagement, facilitate participation in governance and policy making, strengthen links between governments and citizens abroad, and explore mechanisms that enable diaspora contributions, including political participation where nationally appropriate. These commitments have been reinforced through successive AU Assembly decisions and diaspora engagement initiatives, which view political inclusion as complementary to economic investment, knowledge transfer, and cultural exchanges. For instance, Aspiration 2, 5, and 7 of the AU's Agenda 2063 speak to diaspora engagement. Within this particular context, Aspiration 5 mandates the integration of diaspora into continental democratic processes and normalization of dual citizenship. This emphasizes that diaspora engagement should move beyond consultation towards meaningful participation in political institutions and decision-making processes. To this end, 20 member states are reported to have implemented dual citizenship programs. The AU also has a second framework, which is cascaded, looking at the migration policy framework for Africa. And diaspora falls under Pillar 3. And of the 8 pillars and under migration governance, we have diaspora engagements as its pillar, comprising of indicators such as member states that have established policy and institutional frameworks to reach, mobilize, and engage resources and networks of the diaspora. There are also other indicators such as member states implementing diaspora strategic plans, member states with dual citizenship programs for the diaspora, and et cetera, et cetera. So we are in the process of finalizing the midterm assessment of the migration policy framework for Africa to see where countries and regional economic communities are so far as various indicators and stated areas are concerned, particularly as it relates to diaspora engagement. Also at the AU, we have the 2012 Global Africa Diaspora Summit Declaration, which we use as the continental level as our diaspora strategy, which emphasizes on 5 legacy projects. 1 is an Africa Diaspora Skills Database. 2, an Africa Diaspora Volunteer Corps. 3, an Africa Diaspora Investment Fund. 4, a development marketplace for entrepreneurship and innovation. And the 5th is an Africa Institute for Remittances. So these were not just abstract ideas. They are concrete instruments designed to connect the diaspora to development, knowledge transfer, productive investment, and continental integration. We are also developing our perspective of the contribution of the diaspora in terms of three areas. The first is diaspora being perceived in terms of financial capital. This is where we see the diaspora as an indispensable source of remittances, whose contributions to the continent and income is increasing day by day. For instance, in 2025, remittances to Africa constituted about 95 billion USD. And we are not just looking at it from a remittances point of view, but also from an investment point of view. How much diaspora can contribute in terms of investments across the continent. Then we see diaspora as human capital, and this focuses mainly in terms of the skill sets they have to offer in various sectors such as health, education, digital transformation, agriculture, etc., etc. Then there's diaspora as diplomatic capital, which is more or less to leverage on their networks, especially the diaspora that in leadership position in international organizations, etc., etc. So these contributions further strengthen the case for their political inclusion, as well as demonstrate the diaspora's sustained engagement, vested interest, and influence in national development. So to conclude, according to AU norms can be seen as establishing a pro-participation normative framework rather than a continent-wide legal requirement for diaspora voting. So the proposal to recognize the diaspora as Africa's 6th region strengthens the political case for inclusion, while instruments such as the African Charter on Democratic Elections and Governance and the African Charter on Human Rights and People's Rights reinforce member states' obligation to protect political participation. The decision on whether to implement external voting, however, remains primarily a matter for national constitutional and electoral laws. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ture. Thank you very much also for sticking to time. It's true that we had to proceed. We had to ask you to proceed slowly. That said, I'll pass the floor to Ms. Akinduro to make her presentation. You have 15 minutes.
Good morning, everyone. She keeps reminding us to speak slowly, but the speed with which the moderator wants us to speak. But I'll try, and I'll keep my eyes on you. So if I'm going too fast, just please signal me. Good morning. Thank you. If they want to hear, I can. It's okay. Morning, everyone. My name is Olufunto, and I work for International IDEA. It's a pleasure to be part of this conference this morning and to have an opportunity to share some of our work that we've done over time on out-of-country voting. The work I'm presenting today actually draws on two different databases that we have. We have one specific database that looks at out-of-country voting and the trends globally. And we also have another database that looks at special voting arrangements. I consider that these two issues are related because as you plan in the country for voters that have to vote outside, you have to consider them as part of the special voting arrangements that the country has to make for persons within or outside the borders of the country. Just very quickly to define, when we started talking with colleagues at the AU about the theme of this conference, some of the things, that came up for us, we kept asking the question, why are we just saying, diaspora? Because across different countries, the term diaspora is, perceived differently. But just to say that for us, we will just call it broadly, either voting from abroad or out-of-country voting. And it's just basically looking at arrangements made for citizens of a country who have a right to participate in the public affairs of their countries, who are currently outside the borders of their country. So whether they are outside Africa or within Africa, the point is they are not within the borders of their country, and we recognize their right, to participate in the public affairs of their countries. Of course, different debates will come up. If you are not living there, why are you interested to still be part of the affairs of, the country? Quite interesting, key migration trends over the last 20, 30 years. I mean, at some point in the 80s, 90s, migration was always about conflict. People trying to move to more peaceful contexts. But in the last 10 years, we now have more migration trends looking at economic migrants, people moving away from the borders of their countries to look for better opportunities elsewhere. And one of the key trends we've also picked up is what we call youth disengagement. The average young person just wants to make a better living, so if I can do it outside the borders of my country, jolly well will do it. So this is why the issue of out-of-country voting is becoming quite important. If we are seeking to re-engage young people, if we are trying to bring them back to the table politically, we need to look for them wherever they are. So we have a database on out-of-country voting, which we started in 2007. And I mean, as of 2020, we could see a 16% global increase in the adoption of out-of-country voting across the world, including Africa. And even this was data as of 2020. Looking at it now, in 2026, I'm aware that a number of countries, for instance, Gabon, the changes made to the constitution and the electoral laws, a good number of African countries have also, adopted out-of-country voting. The current data, actually, we have 219 countries on the global database, of which 54 are African countries. Out of those 54 countries, 39 countries have out-of-country provisions, out-of-country voting provisions in their laws. 11, we don't have, clarity on the procedures for registration, voting. But even out of those 39, 28 have records of having implemented, because in some countries, there's a legal provision for it. And then the question is, when it comes to the practicalities of how it is done, it becomes more challenging, and electoral commissions then leave that process for future elections where it can be done. So we have 28 countries that actually have records of implementing the out-of-country voter provisions. But of course, implementation is at different levels as you go across the continent. I'll get to that in a minute. Out-of-country voting as well, there are two sides to it. It's also to look at, one, entrenching the right to vote. So in most countries, it is about citizens who are outside the borders being able to vote. Interestingly, to the point that the previous speaker just talked about, looking at the diaspora as an important constituency. You then have countries that go beyond entrenching the right to vote to also entrenching the right to be voted for. So where you now have legal provisions to have the diaspora as a constituency. So you have countries like Mozambique, Cape Verde, where you have members of parliament who are persons who are not resident in their different countries. Looking at the different design choices, there are questions around eligibility. Who is eligible to vote outside? In some countries, when I say full eligibility, it just basically means if you're a citizen of the country and you are registered as a person staying outside, you will have a right to vote. So I'm Nigerian, so we have a thing, we say, like, let's laugh at ourselves first. So someone from INEC Nigeria told me once about how somebody walked in and says, I'm from IEC Botswana. Yeah, how can I help you? What do you want? We are here to register and organize voting for people from Botswana. I never get it. Is it Motswana or Botswana? Botswana. Motswana, who are here. And the man says, oh yes, we're happy to help you. What do you need? We just need to get ballot boxes. So how many people are we looking at? 6. The Nigerian almost gets off his seat laughing because, a country is coming all the way to ensure that 6 people who are outside the borders are voting. When we think of that comparatively, it's more like, wow, an extra effort. But then you then look at partial eligibility. This looks at spaces where you would say maybe people in diplomatic missions, people on official duties. These are the ones that then have the eligibility to vote. So the eligibility to vote in some countries is then not open to just any citizen who is living abroad. It will be that you are a citizen who is registered to a mission abroad, and then the country will give you the right to vote outside. Of course, across board, citizenship of your country is the barest minimum. You can't just pitch up and just wish to vote in an election where you're not a citizen. But there are then key considerations about whether we have dual citizenship questions in some countries. Some countries don't allow you to hold dual citizenship. So when you take on certain citizenship and you've dropped your original citizenship, it's then tough for you to pitch up at an embassy and want to vote. Thank you. What kinds of elections do people vote in? Presidential elections are elections where your country is one national constituency, right? So it makes it quick, it makes it easy. We are all voting on the same ballot, we are all going towards the same place. But some countries also allow voting in parliamentary elections. So parliamentary elections, for instance, looking specifically at in countries where the diaspora is a constituency in itself, then the diaspora will be allowed to vote for that particular constituency. But in some cases, the law allows persons living abroad to still vote in their original home constituencies. Of course, it's an interesting legal conversation because in most countries, you are expected to be resident in the constituency where you are voting. So when you are now a person living abroad and you are interested in voting in that constituency, it's a whole legal conversation. There are regional elections as well. The EU, in Europe, EU member states, persons abroad are allowed to vote, for their EU member of parliament as well. Registration, in some countries, it is in person. You have to go to the embassy of your country and vote. In some, you actually have to travel home during the registration period to vote. Then you will apply for a special vote that says, I will not be, in my home. This is where I would love to vote. In other countries, it is episodic. So that means for every single election, you will have to return and say, I'm interested in voting. A country like Sweden, once you've registered yourself as a person abroad, automatically you will be put on the voters register for 10 years. After that, there is then a process for you to go back and show, I am still resident here, I am paying my taxes at home, and I'm interested in voting in the next election. So there are different systems. Then there's the passive one, where as long as you're in the civic registry, your name just moves on. Voting methods, I can try and take that up in my next slide, which looks at the most common one is in person, and that's how most of the African countries allow people to vote. Postal voting is less common. I think as far as I know, it's only in Zimbabwe I have seen that there's a provision for postal voting. Proxy voting, I think it's only Mauritius. I've seen that has that particular provision, but the operationalization of it, I do not have the full details. It might be great to hear the experience. E-voting, I think Namibia is the only country I know so far when the e-voting machines were being used, they were used abroad. But now that they are no longer in use, the same method at home applies. Finally, my last slide looks at risks and key considerations. There's the question of foreign intervention. There's also the question around who has the full scope of organizing the elections, because the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in most cases is involved in these issues. In some countries, especially countries that have the governmental model of election management, where you then have the Ministry of Internal Affairs being the primary institution that runs the elections. Then you want people abroad to vote, you put in another layer, which is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of those countries. It becomes a bigger question. The transparency, who has access to the ballots before they get into the country, who accompanies them, how are they then handled when they get back into the country to be added to the main votes. There are political perceptions of the diaspora. In some countries, everybody just believes if you leave abroad, you are no friends with the ruling party. So why should we then allow you to have a voice? Some of the risks I've not also listed here. I think the operational considerations around it. I was just speaking to the chair of Gambia just now. The whole conversation in Gambia on the constitution review to say, we would want the diaspora to vote, but let's think through the logistics of it. How do we get to every Gambian embassy. And in Gambia, there's an interesting voting system. So we have to take the ballot drums and the marbles and all those questions. How many embassies would we have? When Nigeria discussed this, the question was, okay, there are so many Nigerians abroad. Is everybody in, it's 14 minutes on my timer, 1 second. But the question is, will everybody then have to go to Washington, D.C. or to London? So the logistics around it becomes, the bigger consideration. But I think my final word would be to say the primary consideration is that as long as these are citizens of the country, special arrangements should be considered, and it's all based on the thoughts around their rights to fully participate in the public affairs of their country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Olufunto. So I'll now pass the floor to Mr. Abrahams to make his presentation. You have 15 minutes, sir.
Thank you. Without any further delay, since we're running against the clock, I thought I'd stand and maybe show you some pictures, because sometimes it's very difficult, especially if you are not currently considering or faced with this dilemma. What you see on the screen currently is what London looked like as a High Commission, also serving as a voting station. These are it's on the corner 2 streets. The first one is where the queue starts, and the second one is the front at the entrance. Because of the fact that there are so many people, you find in this scenario that you have to use tensiles or barriers to form a little bit of a zigzag so that all the people can fit in. In this specific voting station, there were 26,000 people registered, and at the end of the day, I think about just under 14,000 pitched up. And I think that this picture is probably what causes the trepidation with some of us. On the other hand, in the same examples that Olufunto has mentioned, I think it was in 2019, I just so happened to be in Venezuela, and there was just some Electoral Act amendments regarding voting abroad. So I set up a meeting with the ambassador. She dressed very nicely, and I put on my suit, and we had a meal. And at the end of the meal, I said, we now have changes in the legislation which will allow all citizens abroad to vote, and no longer a limitation as previously determined by the legislation. I then asked, how many citizens are in this country? She sat and she thought, and she said, oh, 1. I said, okay, but anyway, that one person maybe should be made aware. So where is he? Do you know the whereabouts of the person? He said, yes, the person is in prison. So you probably find that for most of the citizens of your country, there are certain pockets of concentration which causes the big challenge. However, the challenge, the task is to extend to all and not just to focus on those ones. If you can see here the magnitude of this, these are ballot boxes. I think at the end of the day, there was something like 58 full ballot boxes. And the reason why 58, because you can't have one ballot box and wait for everyone to queue and fill into one box. So all of them are not necessarily filled. You had a full extent of voting. These are party agents sitting there. Now, let me skip through this slide, but very quickly, I think we've already established a baseline, and a lot of the speakers have already echoed that. And skip to the reality. I think that if you want to call it the enemy, too strong a word, or let's say resistance, but I think most importantly, the applicable word here is trepidation. And the reason for trepidation is because of the fact that this voting happens outside of our borders and we do not have much control. We have limited jurisdiction. Our jurisdiction is limited to the embassy inside. So in the case of London, you have to negotiate and arrange with the municipality. And it's quite an involved process, and the central government obviously doesn't get involved in that, so it's the same way that you would do it there. Secondly, over and above the guidelines provided by the African Union, I think that probably for most of us, our constitutions also guarantees the right to vote for all its citizens without limitation. But I think that where we are guilty is that in some cases we try to limit, and without considering the fact that it might be challenged, this right to vote. Mainly, most of us would probably say it's logistical, it's cost, and other factors. So the purpose of my session is just to see how we navigate these risks to prevent the noble goal of inclusion of all African citizens, and that it does not become a constitutional crisis. So what is required to respond to this challenge? I think that structurally we need synthesis of these risks to avoid any crisis. And when I say crisis, it's not necessarily a crisis, but we may have lashback either from the citizens abroad or alternatively from political parties. Whether we do or whether we don't, it's always going to be a contentious matter, and as a result of that, it could potentially influence or damage the credibility of the entire election. Because the difficult thing about the diaspora, there's always difficult to quantify. So a political party could say, I lost this election because all my voters are sitting in Chicago and you did not provide a facility for them. Let's look at the first risk that probably most of us would identify with: logistical and infrastructure. We need to borrow this infrastructure, unlike at home, where we can, on the day as the Electoral Commission, just take charge of voting stations, whether it's schools or other public facilities. We are faced with venues that are built for diplomacy, not for processing tens of thousands of voters in a single day. So what this does is it creates physical bottlenecks, potentially long queues, security perimeters, cross-border transit, and sensitive materials, and it just becomes a nightmare. Accessibility. If one looks at Australia, it's a continent. the size of the USA and also add in the whole of Europe. And there's one voting station, and it's in Perth. So some people, if they want to vote, they have to fly. Alternatively, it would probably be closer to just jump across the sea and go to New Zealand. But it's quite a task. Then the next thing is ballot papers having to move from the embassies through the diplomatic bag process, and any perceived actual breach in the chain of custody, in transporting, could invalidate or cause aspersions on the entire tally of those votes. And I think for most of us, we basically replicate the manual processes that we have back home, and we replicate them abroad. Financial and sustainability of voting abroad. If one looks at London in the example that I just mentioned now, to have one voting station to serve the people there, coming in at £200,000 for one station is a bit much. Imagine spending £200,000, or at least a fraction thereof, at each and every voting station that you have. So it potentially has a financial drain on your resources. The sustainability, once again, under the current scenario of manual voting, if you start extending it in terms of making more facilities available, the cost will just continue to escalate. So what happens in defense, and it's not necessarily just voting related, you find that as budget cuts become necessary, countries, states, increasingly decrease the number of foreign missions. And if you close a foreign mission, effectively, for most of us, you're closing a voting station. So it doesn't stand on its own also. Administrative and structural inclusion. I think this is probably, for me, the one that most of us needs to look at before we need to look at new modalities. Citizens abroad are faced with the challenge of being excluded as a result of the necessary documentation. First and foremost, passports. If you are abroad, I think it's extremely, I won't say difficult, but it's a long process to have your passport renewed. So most people go through the costly, well, those who can afford, to the costly exercise of going back home so that they can apply for that. Secondly, if you have any other additional requirements, voter cards and those things, it just adds an additional burden if we do not extend the administrative facilities for that. So the if you are too rigid, then obviously it causes delays. However, if you are too lax, without real-time verification, then you risk also the infiltration of unverified data. Coming to the end now, last two slides. There's also being abroad, and this vacuum and this distance creates a perception, that the absence of immediate local domestic media and probably observers and party agents, you'll find that those in whose interests it serves will weaponize narratives. The threat, therefore, is that a single unverified digital rumor regarding a diaspora ballot box can delegitimize a clean and domestic election. So how do we move forward? Perhaps the questions for this forum to consider, and I see it is on the agenda, is first of all, if one look at this as pillars supporting the move forward, do we have a database of interoperability? Meaning that can we move from physical paper dependency to real-time API, data links, digital platforms, etc., whether it is for the administrative documents or for voting. Secondly, digital registration portals. I know that in this room, there may be a few of us where you can actually, if you're abroad, the same as if you're in the country, you can apply now, it's continuous. You can apply to register. And the fact that it is in a virtual space means it's accessible, it's verifiable, and it's credible. And thirdly, localized transparency. Diaspora voting and any arrangements cannot be seen as a separate. In the same way that you're transparent with your processes inside the country, similarly, you would also need to do the same for diaspora voting. Just another point is that when it comes to the chain of custody of the vote and the ballot and having them counted, it's important that there be verifiability and transparency throughout the process to ensure its credibility. So I think that, and it has been mentioned, just in closing, that we have 50-odd states, and we also have different applications, different modalities, and there is no one-size-fits-all. But as a forum, I think we have a lot to learn from each other, those who already have taken the leap, to compare notes, to see how we have traversed some of the challenges, and if not, then perhaps in the question sessions and the sessions hereafter, we should engage in that. Thank you, Mr. Facilitator.
Thank you very much, Mr. Abrahams. We're now going to pass the floor to Mr. Christensen, who is joining us via Zoom. Mr. Christensen, if you can hear us, the floor is yours. Mr. Christensen, can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
Perfect. You have the floor.
Okay, great. Can you confirm if my slides are visible?
Yes, they are.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to present.
You have 15 minutes, huh?
Perfect. I'll try to take less than that.
Perfect.
So I'm going to present a short case study on the country of Moldova and the out-of-country voting experience from this country. I'll give you just a little bit of context to demonstrate how this country might be relevant to the African EMBs. And I'll explain sort of the process that they've used, which I think speaks to some of the things which the other speakers have already picked up on, how they dealt with this critical issue about where stations were allocated, what kind of technologies they used, how they built trust around the process. And then I'll unpack also some of the costs, since those have also been mentioned, and a few key lessons for EMBs that might be relevant and for consideration during your event over the next days. So Moldova is a small Eastern European country. It's a middle-income country. So just comparing it in terms of development, if we were in Africa, we would be sort of in between Egypt and South Africa, let's say, in that sort of range. It has a big diaspora. So the estimates are that about a third of the sort of overall, let's say, nation lives outside the country. But it's a small country, so we're talking about 1.2 million people abroad, something like that. And like many countries, it has the diaspora plays a big role in the economy. About 10% of GDP comes from remittances that the diaspora sends home. And though we don't have very firm statistics on it, a significant portion of the diaspora is living irregularly in the countries where they are residents. So they're not always officially registered in those places. In terms of dealing with this as the out-of-country voting, Moldova, it's a small country, but they've set up a pretty big operation in this regard. In the most recent election, they opened about 300 polling stations abroad. And you can see them on the map that's moving on the screen now. So they set them up in 41 countries where there was significant population. And then they also did a pilot in 10 countries for mail-in or postal ballots. And I can talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. This has been a process that's been developed gradually and over time. So Moldova allows the diaspora to vote since 2010 in both parliamentary and presidential elections, but of course not in local elections. And that yellow line on the screen shows how that has developed over time. So the first vote back in 2010 had just 64,000 votes cast abroad. The most recent election, which was last year, they had sort of 280,000. So there has been a pretty substantial increase over time. They have also matched that increase with increasing the number of polling stations. So those are the bars that you see on the chart here. You can see that they started out with initial 75 polling stations, and in the most recent election, it was 300. So there's been this kind of gradual evolution over time, and there's been a lot of learning, I think, in that process. Now, let me talk in terms of nuts and bolts. What's the experience for diaspora voters? So critically here, there's no pre-registration required. There is an optional pre-registration process, and there is an online portal where you can find the nearest polling station. But the voters are able to go to any polling station anywhere in the world on election day. And as long as they have correct documents, including, and I think Ibrahim just mentioned this, including expired passports, they are allowed to register and vote on the day. Most of the polling stations are located either in embassies, in consulates, but more than half of them are in rented premises. So this is one of the things that drives up the costs of this model. The actual voting itself is physical on paper, and they have an electronic system, which I'll talk about, which prevents sort of duplicate voting or repeat voting on the same day. And the voters list, so that's in terms of who's eligible to vote, is drawn from the civil registry. So there isn't a sort of separate registration process. Now, there's this kind of sensitive issue, and I think the other speakers have alluded to it, on the allocation of polling stations. And there is an element of, there's always some political elements here. Moldova, in our case study, has dealt with this in a couple of ways. One is that they set out the criteria really clearly in the election law about how this should be allocated. And they've primarily used the turnout from previous elections as the main data point for determining where polling stations should be allocated. But they also use some other data sources. There's a collaborative process with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as well as with host governments to determine where this is allowed. And of course, some host governments will allow polling just in embassies and consulates. Some will allow it in rented buildings. That is a case-by-case situation. There's also concerns around security. So there have been several instances, for instance, in Ukraine, in Russia, and in Israel, where they have had to make sort of security decisions about where it would be secure to organize polling, given the state of conflict in the countries at the time. And they also do a very kind of consultative process. So everything is published online, and then the public is able to sort of feedback on that, and they do integrate that feedback into the final decisions. So in the last decision, they actually added 3 extra polling stations based on public consultations. So there is a feedback loop there. Now, I mentioned earlier that they use technology to prevent double voting. And this is particularly because voters can go to any polling station. So obviously there's a risk they could go to more than one. They have essentially laptops in the polling stations, both domestically and abroad. And voters are sort of checked in and confirmed to having voted on those laptops. And one of the benefits, they have a sort of results management system that you can see here on the screen. This is live on election day, and it shows real-time turnout around the world. So you can see if you click, for instance, on a country like Italy, and then it will give you sort of disaggregated data in real time throughout the polling process. And this, our experience here is that that has really increased trust in the process. It shows people that there's a lot of transparency in the process, and I think it's helped to counter the sort of perceptions that there might be rigging abroad. On top of this, of course, there are observers and party agents who can observe the process throughout the out-of-country voting process, which is, you know, it's all physical and in person, so that's pretty straightforward. The same website that you can see there also streams the results, the preliminary results from election night onwards. So that is a process which has worked pretty well. Now, I think critically is these questions around voting. Moldova is not the wealthiest country in the world, and so, you know, concerns around costs have been important. So domestic voting, just to give you a comparison, costs about $4 per voter. It's sort of relatively cheap. Voting abroad in the most recent elections is about 60% more than that. So it's about $7.20 per voter. And the majority of that, I don't know if it's too small in the screen, but it's that yellow part of the donut chart there is staff salaries. So the biggest costs there are in paying for the staff that hold these polling stations. You also have rent, which makes up about 8% of that, and then you have the travel costs and logistics. So this is what the voting abroad is work. They also, I mentioned at the beginning that they did try to do a mail-in voting. It's kind of a pilot process that was started in 24 and 25. That has come out as significantly more costly. It's about $43 per voter, and more than 60% of that cost goes into the mail costs. So the postage, both getting to the voter and returning from it. So that's come out as significantly more expensive. And then the IT costs related to that have also been made up about a quarter of that cost. So that's how things look in terms of the budgeting. Now, just very quickly, not to talk too much about politics, but it's always on our mind when we're talking about elections. There has been you know, some discussion domestically about the legitimacy of the diaspora vote, particularly as it has been in some recent contests where it has, you know, helped to determine the outcome of the elections. The diaspora often has, you know, different political preferences from those who are at home. We've seen some of the parties also shift sides on this issue over time, as you may have seen in some of your countries. And then, you know, there is always questions around the map about where polling stations are and they aren't. Different parts of the diaspora have had different kind of political preferences. And so the amount of polling stations and their allocation has been a political discussion here domestically. And I will close on just a couple of lessons that I think maybe we could learn from this case study. One is around interinstitutional coordination. I think some of the successes of this model have been in the kind of pretty tight cooperation between the EMB and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as well as with host country authorities. And that's covering, you know, different bits of this, right? So the operational coordination, also the security coordination, and then around the strategic communication. Misinformation and disinformation are obviously something which, you know, target out-of-country voting regularly, and so that has been an area where there's need to be a lot of cooperation, and I think they've seen some success on that. A second is cybersecurity. As soon as you get sort of digital endpoints outside your country, you know, you have to tighten up those links. What has been done here is sort of using VPN connections to the polling stations abroad and then building a really sort of strong cyber shield for the counting and results system. That's worked pretty well, but it's a test every single election. We've seen, as I think I mentioned earlier, about how technology, I think particularly live turnout and sort of near real-time results have really improved trust in the process. And I think Moldova has shown that out-of-country voting doesn't have to be sort of extraordinarily expensive. It is more expensive than domestic voting, but but less than I guess it could be. And I think there's some positive lessons learned on a very kind of evidence and data-based expansion of this process over time since it was first in 2010. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. I'm sorry I can't be with you there in person, and I'm very happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Christensen. So before we open the floor for questions from the room, I have just a few follow-up questions, okay? So I want to find out, in your opinion, this is addressed to you, Funto, for instance, where do you see the biggest tensions between expanding diaspora vote inclusion and safeguarding transparency and integrity of the votes? And for you, Mr. Toure, if you can speak to what you think are the most urgent reforms that countries should prioritize, so maybe legal reforms or institutional reforms you think that countries need to implement in order to give effect to diaspora voting. And to you, Granville, and also to Mr. Christensen, how do you think EMBs and partners can work together to ensure that diaspora communities are not only allowed to vote, but that they are able to verify that indeed their vote is treated fairly and it's effective? Funto, you have the floor. You have 1 minute. That'll be fine.
Thank you very much, Chinedu. So I think that the question on, expanding the right to vote wherever you are versus the question of transparency. The first thing I'll say is that elections are all about perceptions. So it's about what do the people think. So once there's a mindset that if we are not there, there's a point, Grenfell made about absence of, party agents, the fact that your traditional observers are not going to be there, and questions like, oh, this is being run by the embassy, these are government officials. So already, it's the bigger question of perceptions. Secondly, sitting in the space of mis and disinformation, how information is then distilled around what are the procedures, how do I get access to it, who has right of access to it, when the voting is done, who is there to check what are the checks, how do the things come in. So there's also the key tension around voter education around it. All the work we do is primarily targeted towards voters in country. But there's very limited, attention to that question of, okay, this set of people who will be voting outside, to what extent, do we have to share information about? So I think these are like the bigger tension points. But the conversations from other speakers have also highlighted, certain changes that need to be made to respond to the question of perceptions and the question of mis and disinformation. But I think that really is where the balance begins to tilt. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Toure?
Yeah, thank you. So to respond to your question in terms of obligations of member states in terms of rights to citizens, I think this question more or less stems from the notion that the diaspora has been recognized by the AU as the sixth region, which sets the stage or gives the undertone for member states to change their policies and legal frameworks as far as diaspora voting is concerned. So maybe in terms of obligations, maybe we can say, for instance, citizens abroad, which includes the right to vote and the right to stand, they should be given the right to vote, the right to stand for public office, freedom of political association, access to political information, consular protection, and in facilitating political participation. Also, maybe governments can look to facilitate external voting through embassies and external voting through postal voting, early voting, electoral restoration systems, but also they can maintain citizenship links through expanded dual citizenships, for instance, simplified passport renewals, improved consular registration, and created diaspora ministries and agencies. And also maybe consult diaspora communities through national development planning, constitutional reforms, electoral reforms, and public policy and consultations. So I just want to emphasize on the last aspect, because this is key. Because from the AU we can propose ideas, but the onus is on the member states to actually make those reforms, especially when it comes to legal and institutional reforms, and the onus lies on the member states to do so.
Thank you very much, Mr. Toure. Granville?
Yes, thanks. My question was, how do I think
EMBs and
partners not only ensure that those abroad are allowed to vote, but how can they verify their vote? Now, when you say they, if I could answer it two ways. First and foremost, if they refers to the voter, then we need to be very careful that we compare it to voting locally. I don't know what measures or if there is any assurance that the voter inside of the country is able to verify that his or her vote was counted, other than trusting the process and also through the presence of observers and party agents, etc. But there is one way that it could possibly be done, but that is if you go fully electronically through the application of blockchain. But I think that is probably a bit too esoteric for most of us and probably for most of our voters. So I think that transparency, if they refers to the contestants, and just in terms of ensuring that there's trust in the process, that it's important that the entire process is transparent and it's educated. In my experiences, for example, for South African voters abroad, we use the double envelope system, and a lot of people did not understand why they had to write their ID number and details on the outer envelope. And once they were explained, they understood the process, because it goes through a verification process when it goes back home, that the outer envelope is then discarded and it loses its identity once it's been verified, and the inner envelope, which is unmarked, then contains the ballot. So I think voter education, not just for those abroad, but also for those inside of the country, specifically contestants, because that way you probably end up getting most of your criticism and the potential, as I've mentioned, impacting on the credibility of the entire election. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Granville. Mr. Christensen.
Yes.
Can you hear us?
Yeah, absolutely. Can you hear me? Testing.
Perfect.
Testing. Yeah,
Great.
okay.
So the question was, how do you think EMBs and partners like UNDP can work together to ensure that the diasporas is not only allowed to vote, but that they can verify that their votes are treated fairly?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think what we really need to think about in this context is that the diaspora is, it's a constituency like any other. And so for the EMB, for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and for the partners, that constituency sort of needs to be engaged, right? And you've seen some EMBs, for instance, setting up, specific web portals, engaging in specific voter education campaigns, etc., that are aimed at those diaspora. But I think we've really seen the difference is really made in the quality of the diaspora organizations in the host countries where they're residing. because those are the organizations which, you know, can also engage with the authorities, can engage in the kind of voter education that we talked about, can organize around observation, can organize to encourage turnout. And I think what we've seen is the difference between, you know, one context and another in terms of turnout, in terms of the quality of the process. It has everything to do with how strong the domestic observation is. So I think a lot of it, yeah, a lot of it relates to how those communities are organized, and that is something that we should be encouraging. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Christensen. So just to quickly summarize some of the points that have been raised before we open up the floor, I think Mr. Toure spoke about, from the AU's perspective, that the issue of diaspora voting is a matter of wider political participation for all citizens, irrespective of where they are based. And this is also recognizing that their contributions to national development. So it's looking at it fully. As a full citizen, you have rights, but you also have, as you have obligations, you should also enjoy rights, okay? And Funto spoke about also clarifying this concept of diaspora voting or out-of-country voting. And laid painted the picture that on the African continent, we already have 39 out of the 54 countries that have provisions for out-of-country voting. And 28 have actually gone ahead to implement it in one form or the other. And she also raised the issue about materiality, the numbers. Unlike in country where you have significant numbers, when you go to the diaspora, then the numbers start getting smaller. Right, and this also links up to the issue of the cost. I think that Mr. Christensen spoke about, and this is something that matters to us a lot. Yes, because we live on a continent where the vast majority of our countries are resource constrained. So these are very important points to raise. Just these few points, and then I'll open up the floor for questions. And we'll take 3 questions at a time and hand back to the panelists to present, to provide answers, and we'll see how far we can go with that before we close. So I have one hand there. Any other questions? Oh, 1, 2, and 3. Okay. Ambassador, okay, you have the floor. The mic. Can we get a mobile mic? It's not working.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. And I think this question of diaspora voting is very, very, very key question for EMB. And the question I want to ask to the presenter, do you think, based on the constraint, logistic and financial constraint of EMB's country today, is it useful, even though there is international normative disposition to involve everybody, all the citizens, is it useful for the electoral process in Africa? I'm asking this question because if I take the example of Côte d'Ivoire in 2010, they sent 3 people for 3 weeks in Chinese to make registration of 10 citizens of Côte d'Ivoire. Is it necessary I want your view about that, because you have to be concrete today and discuss about this thing. Because I noticed that politicians, when their interest is out of country, they will cry that they have to vote. When they don't have interest in diaspora voting, they will forget about it. So please clarify this for me. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Chairman Widow.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the discussion. For being from Liberia, we have legal system that is concerning the elections that are now on the level of the electoral laws. Most issues concerning elections in Liberia, they are entrenched in the constitution. Even up to the time the time for voting, the date of vote is indicated in the constitution. And that could present a very complicated process of amendment at the level of parliament. Like my colleague from Africa just said, if the majority members in parliament feel that diaspora voting would be against their interests, you can consider that issue dead in parliament. But my question is the issue of campaign. It was to say, okay, we agree that this issue is accepted and is practical, considering financial, logistical, and other constraints as we have all, as have been indicated. How does candidates from African countries go to Western countries to campaign? Because if the diaspora become a constituency, then for me, we have our biggest diaspora population in the United States, as of Liberia. How does candidates go to America to campaign? What is the framework? What is the legal process that will be put in place to protect them? Because when you say people are there to vote, of course the candidates will have to go there and campaign. How do we intend to handle that? Thank you.
Thank you. Sir, please just keep your question short and simple. We are running out of time.
Good morning. My name is Mohammed Sofian Barrah. I am the ambassador of Algeria to the Arab Republic of Egypt. I present here the national authority of election back home. Not about question, but maybe to share experience. Since we concluded 4 days ago an election, and this was a very challenging experience for us, but with one particular. This is maybe something that could be addressed by your panel. This particular experience of Algeria of having a representative of the diaspora within the parliament. This, in our view, encourages the participation of the diaspora in the process. We moved from 8 seats in the parliament to 12 seats, representing 8 regions throughout the world. This, in my view, is the best way to ensure inclusiveness and participation of diaspora in the electoral process. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your contribution. I'll just take the gentleman, Mr. Kamati, and a final question from Mr. Mohammed Lemin. Mr. Kamati, you have the floor.
I will speak in Portuguese, so sorry.
Oh, we need do you have your headset? Granville, you need to get your headset. He's going to speak in Portuguese. No, you're the one who's going to. Okay, let me hear. Go ahead, sir.
Bom dia a todos e as minhas felicitações pelas palestras. A minha pergunta é dirigida à senhora Akinduro. dê um exemplo de uma realização de eleições da diáspora que foram apenas 7 eleitores. Bom, antes de eu fazer a pergunta, tenho a dizer que Angola também tem votos na diáspora. A partir das eleições passadas de 2022, nós conseguimos organizar eleições também na diáspora, em alguns países, porque de facto é um desafio muito grande. Mas a questão é, justifica que se faça uma logística tão cara, tão elevada, apenas porque queremos garantir o direito do voto de 7 eleitores na diáspora? Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. So finally, Mr. Lamine.
Ok. Merci. Merci pour les intervenants qui ont assez bien venu sur
Monsieur
la
Lamine,
problématique des élections.
vous pouvez aller droit à la question, hein, s'il vous plaît. Nous sommes à court de temps, donc oui. Allez-y directement à votre question.
En ce qui concerne le vote à l'étranger, c'est vrai que c'est nécessaire, mais il y a généralement, on a beaucoup discuté avec les partis politiques, avec les principaux acteurs, pour arrêter quelque chose de normal, d'acceptable pour tous. Et à ce niveau, nous avons 4 grandes circonscriptions électorales de l'extérieur, l'Afrique, l'Asie, l'Europe et l'Amérique, les cas mauritaniens en tout cas. Et à ce niveau, on s'est dit que si on n'a pas, au niveau d'une liste électorale, il n'y a pas un minimum de 1000 citoyens inscrits, il n'y aura pas d'ouverture de bureaux de vote, tout simplement. Et à ce niveau, ça nous a permis effectivement de pouvoir avoir les moyens d'encadrer le vote à l'étranger pour les grandes communautés qui dépassent cela. Je vous remercie.
Okay, merci. So I'm going to pass the floor to our panelists. I'll come to you, Funto, first, because the gentleman from Angola asked a question that is similar to Ambassador Oki's question, and it's about how pertinent it is to organize specifically about Angola. He asked whether you have examples where you have only very few voters, and how do you link it up with the amount of logistics you have to put in place to ensure that these people vote? How does it make sense?
Thank you very much. I wonder why I got the hardest question. So, it's an interesting one because we all seem to be asking the question around the numbers versus the costs. But I think it's important to say that out-of-country voting, for most countries that adopt it, is well entrenched in the history of the country. So I consider that for most countries, if you look at the history of countries adopting out-of-country voting, most countries came to that point at transition. They made that decision in transition elections. So elections where you have lots of displaced citizens, or Southern African countries steeped in the history of the liberation struggle, and people had left. Questions around transitional justice. So these become quite historical reasons why you then design your electoral process the way it is. Sometimes, for example, I remember last year when we went, 2024, when we went for the EU elections and we visited 3 countries. And we were looking at the special voting arrangements, and I said to myself, wow, if I compare what I'm seeing in these 3 countries to the extent that South Africa will go, people in prison, people in hospitals, elderly people in their homes, literally, even if you're under a rock, they will find you and you will vote. I think it's really about the history and why we choose to do those. But that does not blind us to sometimes the politics behind it. And I think Mr. Christensen in his presentation talked about it, that politicians will change their stand from time to time. This time I want it, when I see it's not working for me, I'm the one that will be in parliament after the election and now saying, drop that particular, provision. So I think my answer to it is this. The right to vote is a fundamental thing. And I made a point at the beginning of the presentation. Africa is seeing a huge youth disengagement. I come from a country, we even have a name for it, Jakpa, which means just leave. So if you're looking to engage the new generation of voters, and all you want to do is say, be in your home, in your own constituency, and that is where you would vote, I think the future of our African politics would really, really depend on where we go with how far we are willing to go after people that are far away to get them to vote. So I wouldn't directly answer the question of if it is 6 voters. I gave the example of Botswana. 6 voters, and the person from INEC Nigeria is like, excuse me, you traveled all the way for 6 people. Yeah. Or whether it is then 1 million voters. It's really how we see the history of it and the future that comes with it.
So in other words, it's not a straightforward thing. There are other considerations, yes. I'd also turn around to you, Granville. Costs versus turnout.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, but we know when we plan elections within our borders, or let's say when we run elections within our borders, we plan. So I must say that I find it a bit surprising. I don't understand the mechanism, but I find it a bit surprising that we would have sent 3 people to China to deal with 7 voters. Now, the way to mitigate that is, and I think the model that probably a lot of us are either employing or would employ, and it's absolutely necessary, because we do not plan elections without knowing how many people we expect. So for voting abroad, you would normally have if you don't have a voters roll, like in South Africa's case, they actually have an international segment. But anybody else who's not on the segment, who wishes to vote abroad, can do a pre-enrollment to say, I'm a registered voter, but I'm going to be in China. So before the ballot papers gets dispatched, you know exactly what the maximum number of people are, and you plan for that maximum. So if the maximum was 10, you would send 1 book of ballot papers, and you would ask the ambassador to take 1 or 2 of the staff members, and they man the station. So you have no venue hire costs, you have no staffing costs, and the only cost that you have is couriering, and that will probably in most cases be through the diplomatic bag. So it's important that we plan for this, because if we don't, then I'm not saying the cost can be avoided. It is expensive. But if we do not plan for it, then we're writing a blank check.
Mr. Ture, I'll direct the question from Chairman Widow to you. With respect to encouraging participation of citizens abroad, what about the implication it has for those who are standing for election, so for the candidates? What do you think about costs, for instance, for a candidate who needs to go and campaign for Sierra Leoneans living in the US, for instance? What do you think about that?
Yeah, and that's an interesting question. But for me, just to say again, it's about the legislation for, allowing for citizens living abroad to vote. So if that has been enshrined within the national policies, the national frameworks, the national laws, etc., then automatically it legitimizes the candidates having to go to other countries to campaign. However, I know he made mentions to issues relating to jurisdiction, whether also now when that would now be legal in those countries, in the external countries, for them to campaign. But again, somebody made mention of associations in the diaspora. So I think this is why it's important to have diaspora groups, or more credible diaspora groups or associations through which candidates or political figures can engage the diaspora in the various continents or in the various regions. So as long as they exist and they are credible and legitimate, I think that should serve as an entry point for politicians to engage the diaspora across those regions.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. There is interest, but then we have run out of time. But I think the pattern short for me, and this is listening to both Funto and Granville's responses, is that diaspora voting should not, at least for EMBs, should not be apprehended from the prism of, oh, it's cost effective, right? But more from the perspective of giving effect to the rights of citizens abroad, irrespective of what it costs. Thank you very much for your rapt attention.
A quick one, please. Have a picture, then you can. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Shall we applaud them? We are going straight into our next section. And for housekeeping, please, if you want to visit the washroom, you go out your extreme left. You see a blue door. That's where the washroom is. Thank you very much. We are into the next session. I wanted to sit closer to you. No, she is coming. She's only one person. No, how many? Three people. So do that. Thank you.
Panelists, please join me. Commissioner. Mr. Ayachi, please join us. Please have a seat. Okay. Could you find me Mr. Ayachi from Tunisia?
Please, Mr. Ayachi from Tunisia. Is he here with us? He has stepped out.
I think in the interest of time, while you help us find him, we can proceed. Good, thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lenny, and I have the pleasure of moderating this panel where we will be speaking particularly about experiences from Cape Verde, Tunisia, South Africa, who have successfully so managed to navigate the out-of-country voting in varying degrees of it. Others, South Africa has just managed to let the people vote. Cape Verde has representation in parliament, similar to Tunisia, but they only give a certain number of seats, so we'll be able to hear from their experiences. From Cape Verde, we have Madame Cristina Maria Neves de Souza. I hope I pronounced it properly. She's the Vice President at the National Election Commission. Correct? Good. Then we have Mr. Ayachi. We'll find him shortly. He's a board member of the Independent Supreme Authority for Elections in Tunisia. And then we have, finally, Mr. Glenn Mashinini, who is a commissioner at the Independent Electoral Commission of South Africa. So, Madam, will you please start us off? Good.
Ok. Bom dia. Sou de Cabo Verde. A senhora facilitadora, Madame Melan, fez questão de apresentar. Em primeiro lugar, agradeço o convite de poder partilhar aqui a nossa experiência e poder partilhar na minha língua portuguesa, que é a minoria dentro da União Africana. E por isso agradeço essa atenção que a organização teve de poder falar na minha própria língua. Cabo Verde é um arquipélago constituído por 10 ilhas, sendo 9 habitadas, com pouco mais de 500 mil de habitantes. Mas a sua diáspora é imensa e está espalhada pelo mundo, que, segundo as estimativas, é de cerca do dobro dos residentes. A nossa migração internacional para fora do continente africano começou em meados do século XVIII e teve a pesca da baleia como seu principal impulsionador, muito por causa da nossa localização geográfica, que servia de escala aos navios que vinham dos Estados Unidos da América, para reabastecimento de água e alimentos e para o recrutamento de marinheiros. E estes viam essa oportunidade como uma forma de fugir às severas crises de fome e de seca cíclicas que assolavam o nosso arquipélago. Assim, este tema para este fórum não poderia ser mais pertinente, não só para Cabo Verde, como também para todos os países africanos, cuja população, como sabemos, fruto de diversas circunstâncias, vê-se obrigada a emigrar para outras latitudes à procura de melhores condições de vida ou simplesmente de paz que não conseguem nos seus países de origem. Eu preparei uma apresentação, mas, dada ao tempo que vamos dispor, eu vou aqui apenas referir quanto ao nosso quadro legal de Cabo Verde e depois ficava à disposição para a facilitadora. Em termos do quadro legal, nós somos uma jovem democracia com cerca de 35 anos e com a revisão da nossa Constituição da República em 1992, a nação cabo-verdiana optou por um Estado de direito democrático que, enraizado nas ideias da soberania popular e do pluralismo de expressão e da organização política, assume a democracia representativa como forma de governo e reconhece aos cidadãos cabo-verdianos residentes no estrangeiro. Estou pressionada por causa do tempo, mas tenho que fazer uma pausa, falar mais pausadamente por causa da tradução. Obrigada. Portanto, reconhece aos cidadãos cabo-verdianos residentes no estrangeiro o direito de participarem nas mesmas condições que os residentes no território nacional, nas eleições dos deputados à Assembleia Nacional e do Presidente da República, enquanto concretização do direito fundamental de igualdade, na sua dimensão de participação política, para além de se admitir a dupla nacionalidade aos nossos cidadãos. Nessa conformidade, o recenseamento eleitoral é oficioso, obrigatório, permanente e único para todas as eleições por sufrágio universal direto e secreto, sendo que para efeitos do recenseamento no estrangeiro, a respectiva unidade geográfica é o país de residência do eleitor, que contrapõe à unidade geográfica do recenseamento no território nacional, que é feita ao nível municipal. A organização do recenseamento no estrangeiro é distinguida em dois períodos, um no período eleitoral e outro fora do período eleitoral. No período eleitoral, que começa 240 dias anteriores à data que legalmente se completa o mandato dos titulares do órgão, o recenseamento fica a cargo de uma comissão de recenseamento para cada unidade geográfica de recenseamento no estrangeiro, que é composto por um funcionário consular ou diplomático, com exceção do embaixador, e por 4 cidadãos idóneos, eleito pela Assembleia Nacional por maioria de 2/3 dos deputados, sob proposta do Governo, no qual deve ser assegurada o pluralismo político com expressão parlamentar. Essas comissões, assim criadas no estrangeiro, funcionam junto dos postos consulares e das nossas embaixadas, acreditadas na respectiva unidade geográfica, os quais estão constituídos na obrigação de lhes prestar todo o apoio logístico e material e toda a colaboração solicitada, sem prejuízo do seu estatuto de independência funcional. São igualmente agendadas deslocações dentro de cada país por forma a possibilitar o recenseamento dos cidadãos previamente publicitadas por essas comissões. Fora do período eleitoral, são as próprias representações consulares que têm a atribuição de registar os nossos cidadãos no estrangeiro. É um recenseamento que fica sujeito à fiscalização dos partidos políticos, que têm os seus representantes nessas comissões de recenseamento, por forma a garantir a transparência. Para efeitos da organização do colégio eleitoral, na eleição do Presidente da República, o conjunto dos países nos quais residem os eleitores constitui um único círculo eleitoral do estrangeiro, a par do círculo eleitoral nacional, sendo que cada cidadão eleitor recenseado no estrangeiro dispõe de um voto, equivalendo o total desses votos ao máximo a 1/5 dos votos apurados no território nacional. Já na eleição dos deputados à Assembleia Nacional, os eleitores residentes fora do território nacional são agrupados em 3 círculos eleitorais, todos com sede na capital do país, abarcando um círculo os países africanos, um círculo os países americanos e um terceiro os países europeus e o resto do mundo. Quando dizemos resto do mundo, porque nós temos também eleitores na China e na região de Macau. Os círculos da imigração elegem 6 deputados, de um total de 72 deputados que compõem à Assembleia Nacional, distribuídos 2 por cada círculo eleitoral. E, normalmente, os candidatos são os próprios imigrantes nesses círculos eleitorais. Os cidadãos podem votar com documentos nacionais caducados ou com documentos de identificação do seu país de acolhimento, por forma a facilitar a participação. O apuramento dos resultados, uma vez feito o apuramento nas mesas de voto, o apuramento definitivo é feito pela própria Comissão Nacional de Eleições, através da remessa da documentação que vem do estrangeiro, através dos nossos postos consulares. Por forma a facilitar o processo de apuramento, num primeiro momento os documentos são todos digitalizados, as atas, os editais, são remetidos e, através da mala diplomática, é remetida toda a documentação para Cabo Verde. E os resultados, como devem imaginar, ter mesas de voto em todos os continentes praticamente e com fusos horários distintos, a transmissão é feita dos resultados parciais, é feito no próprio dia da eleição, o que garante a transparência do processo e a confiança dos cidadãos quanto à integridade desses resultados. Eu fico por aqui à espera de questões, dada a limitação do tempo. Eu fico à disposição da senhora facilitadora. Muito obrigada.
Thank you very much, and thank you for sticking to the time. So we'll hear from Tunisia. The presentation is up. In the interest of time, you can skip the part where it has the legal provisions that guarantee diaspora voting, and just get into the details of the operationalization of it. You have 10 minutes.
أهلا بالجميع. شكرا للحضور الكرام. سأعرض وأكون إن شاء الله مقتصد في الوقت الممنوح لي لعرض التجربة التونسية للانتخابات بالخارج. إذن تونس منذ 2011 قامت دائما بانتخابات في 5 أقطار من العالم لمواطنينا المقيمين بالخارج. وهذه الانتخابات كانت في من الأول في 6 دوائر عفوا، ثم في السنوات الأخيرة انتقلنا في 2024 إلى وسعنا إلى 10 دوائر. وكنا في حدود في الأول طبعا بعد ثورة 2011 كان عندنا بعض الصعوبات في تسجيل المواطنين التوانسة المقيمين بالخارج، فكنا في حدود 350 ألف يعني ناخب مسجل بالخمسة قارات. وانتقلنا بآلية التسجيل الآلي الهيئة وبالقانون الانتخابي الجديد. إذن تمكنا من استعمال تقنية التسجيل الآلي، وبذلك انتقلنا من 350 ألف حوالي ناخب إلى تقريبا أضعف 640 ألف ناخب بالخارج، موزعين على 317 مركز في الخمسة قارات، أوروبا والأمريكيتين والدول العربية وافريقيا واسيا واستراليا. طبعا هذوما يتوزع عليهم متوزعين على 59 دولة في العالم. ال 317 مركز محدثين فيهم 408 مكتب اقتراع. طبعا التوزيع يختلف من أماكن إلى أماكن. فيه إذن أماكن فيها كثافة من المقيمين التونسيين في هذه البلدان. أنا أخذ على سبيل المثال فرنسا فيها 3 دوائر انتخابية، بينما في أماكن أخرى وفي قارات أخرى يعني الدوائر تكون فما دائرة واحدة أو 2. إذن مثل ما قلنا المجموع هو 640 ألف ناخب مسجل على 59 دولة في 10 دوائر انتخابية. هذه إذن الإحصائيات وهذا التوزيع. كما قلت أسلفت أن فرنسا عندنا فرنسا 1 فرنسا 2 فرنسا 3. في إيطاليا كذلك عندنا عدد لا بأس به 88 ألف ناخب تونسي مسجل. باقي الدول الأوروبية 62 ألف، والدول العربية 50 حوالي 51 ألف، الأمريكيتين 22 ألف، أفريقيا 819 وآسيا 817. هذوما اللي سجلوا أقل يعني عدد من التونسيين المتواجدين فيهم. طبعا كما سمعنا وتحدث الأخوة الكل أن الانتخابات في الخارج فيها صعوبات، وخاصة الصعوبات الجغرافية واللوجستية أساسا. والصعوبات اللوجستية هي التمكن من إحداث هذه المراكز ومكاتب الاقتراع. نحن نتركز في تجربتنا نتعامل ب يعني سلاسة ومرونة مع نعتمد أساسا على تمثيلياتنا القنصلية وسفاراتنا بالخارج بالاشتراك مع والتعاون مع وزارة الخارجية التونسية. وإذا لم نتمكن من ذلك ولم يكن هناك تمثيليات في بعض هذه الأماكن فنلتجئ سواء إلى اقتراع يعني فضاءات، أو إذا كان تفضل معناتها الدول والسلطات المحلية بتوفير الفضاءات لإحداث مكاتب ومراكز اقتراع. طبعا هذا في حد ذاته يعني نوعا ما يحدث شوية صعوبات في لوجستيا في وجود إذن هذه الفضاءات والقرب لناخبينا. نحن إذن نحاولوا أقصى جهودنا باش نكونوا أقرب ما يمكن حسب الممكن والمتاح. فرأى أنه عندنا 195 فضاء يعني ممنوحة من طرف السلطات المحلية والبلدان بلدان الإيواء، و70 مقرات دبلوماسية بعثات دبلوماسية تونسية، و52 فضاءات مكترات. عندما نقول مكترات طبعا كما كانوا يحكيوا الإخوة فهذا ينجر عليه طبعا كلفة وبالعملة الصعبة. كذلك في هذه التحديات التي تعترضنا هي تأمين هذه المراكز. ساعات نبقى ننتظر في ردود الدول المستضيفة إلى آخر الأوقات، فهذا يحدث إذن شوية يعني ضغط لوجستي وتنظيمي. كذلك زيادة على التكلفة هناك قيود أمنية ومعناتها خاصة بالبلدان المستضيفة لا نستطيع تجاوزها دائما. إذن كما ترون يعني هناك سلسلة امدادات لوجستية حول العالم، ويمكن في أثناء الوقت القصير إذن لتنظيم الانتخابات يمكن أن تحدث بعض الظروف الخاصة من ضياع، يعني احنا خاطر نبلغ يعني المواد الحساسة الانتخابية الحساسة يلزمها تكون متواجدة بمراكز ومكاتب الاقتراع يوم الاقتراع، يوم يفتح الاقتراع يلزم تكون متواجدة وتفتح كل المكاتب في التوقيت مع مراعاة إذن الاختلاف في الأوقات ما بين الدول والقارات. لازم تكون المكاتب جاهزة لاستقبال الناخبين التونسيين. طبعا احنا كما قلنا يعني أكبر الصعوبة هي القرب والاتصال واستقطاب الناخبين التونسيين يعني في أماكن تواجدهم. نحاولوا أقصى ما يمكن ونحاولوا استعمال كذلك كل المتاح تكنولوجيا ولوجستيا باش نوفروا كل الظروف لانتخابات ناجحة شفافة وحرة. فإطاراتنا كيف زاد احنا وأعواننا فيه ننتدبوا في الوقت هذاك في ظروف يعني في أجيال قصيرة ننتدبوا كل ما يلزم إذن الإشراف وتنظيم هذه وإنجاز الانتخابات من هيئات فرعية بالخارج، وكذلك أعوان وكل ما يتطلبوا الانتخابات، ونوفر لهم كذلك التكوين اللازم حتى درءا للأخطاء وربما الأحداث اللي تنجم تعيق انتخابات يعني كما يجب نزيهها وذات إذن مصداقية. إذن كما نرى هنا أن احنا عندنا الهيئة تتوافق على 72 ساعة من عندما تنطلق التصويت، يدوم 72 ساعة لأنه أول مكتب يفتح في سيدني وآخر مكتب للتصويت يغلق في سان فرانسيسكو في أمريكا. وإذن هذا طبعا طيلة 72 ساعة فإن الهيئة تونس وكذلك فروعها في الخارج هي في إذن حالة طوارئ مستمرة ل 72 ساعة حتى يغلق آخر مكتب تصويت في كما قلنا في فرانسيسكو. فنحن إذن في التقاط وملاحظة ومتابعة كل الأحداث، ويجب التدخل حسب الإمكان وحينيا لربما معناتها تسوية بعض الإشكالات. النتائج نحن نستبق في النتائج بالخارج، حيث أن تقع يعني مسح ضوئي لكل المحاضر للنتائج. وهناك قاعة عمليات مركزية في تونس، في الهيئة المركزية في تونس التابع، وتستبق إذن عملية تجميع الأصوات وتحضير النتائج. قبل أن تتم إذن وصول هذه المحاضر يكون أن النتائج إذن قد جمعت. إذن سأسرع قليلا لضيق الوقت، فخلنا نمشيو لآخر إذن الإشكالات ونحوصل. هناك تجربة قمنا بها وكانت نعتبر احنا اللي هي ناجحة، هو ما سميناه احنا التصويت الحر بالخارج، وهو في الواقع هو التصويت ديما تصويت حر، لكن أتحنا للمواطن التونسي المقيم بالخارج أنه يصوت في أقرب مكتب اقتراع ليه هو في المكان اللي هو متواجد فيه. ينجم يكون هو مسجل في إيطاليا، ونهارة الاقتراع هما الاقتراع في الخارج بالنسبة لنا احنا بالقانون هما 3 أيام بالنسبة لمواطنينا في الخارج. هذا لنمكنهم معناتها، هذه معناتها استثناء لهم هما بالنسبة للمواطنين في الداخل. ف3 أيام هذوكم نمكنوا إذن المواطن التونسي باش ينتخب في أقرب مكتب اقتراع هو في المكان اللي هو متواجد فيه، وننقل إذن التصويت نتاعو عن طريق التكنولوجيات والشبكات الحديثة. هذا لا يخلو إذن من بعض المخاطر ومعناتها التكنولوجية، ونتأكدوا اللي ما ينجمش معناتها هو لا يمكن له أن يصوت في مكان آخر. هذا معناتها حطينا الإجراءات اللازمة الأمنية السيبرانية اللازمة، وقمنا بالعملية هذه ونجحنا فيها، وسجلت لنا في انتخابات الرئاسية متاع 2024 تقدم وبقيمة 16% من نسبة الأصوات المسجلة. إذن أخيرا وأنهي بهذا، هذا إذن حوصلة لتشخيص التحديات للانتخابات بالخارج، وهذا نجم نقول معناتها متعرض له أي هيئة انتخابية تنظم انتخابات، هي العوائق التشريعية. احنا في الخارج مثال في افريقيا لم نسجل يعني نسبة تاع ترشحات يعني كبيرة لأجل عوائق قانونية وتشريعية. كذلك هناك كما قلنا القيود الجغرافية، وكذلك التحديات التقنية والبشرية. هذه كلها صعوبات مطروحة على كل الإدارات الانتخابية، وإحنا كهيئة تونس للانتخابات مفتوحة على كل النقاشات وعلى كل التعاون مع كل أي هيئة إفريقية لأن نتبادلوا ونتقاسموا يعني التجربة متاعنا. وشكرا وسمحونا على الإطالة.
Thank you. Even though you took double the time, we appreciate your input. Tate Mashinini, you can take the podium. We are particularly very interested in the South African experience, considering in as much as we already had existing legal framework, particularly when you're looking at the previous national election. But then we had a lot of litigation around out-of-country voting that added a new layer of complication for that national election. So we would like to hear how you managed to navigate this out-of-country voting. Yes, you have 10 minutes, the actual 10 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Program Director. No, it's let's see if I can make your job a little bit easier. Indeed, as already indicated, the issue of voting abroad in South Africa is one that one can point out has evolved over the period of time. But to start with, let me just share with you what have been the broad key drivers that we have experienced. Firstly, I think it is the paramount, it's our constitution and the rule of law that provides for citizens to have a right for their voice to be registered or for their right to vote. And so that is the foundation and the basis, and all state institutions are then bound by the principle of the rule of law, that everything and anything you do must align itself to the law of the land. The second category of the activities that we see, it's the administrative. As an EMB, you have the responsibility to oversee your mandate as provided for in the laws. So we have clear provisions and the mandate to evolve the interpretation and application of the laws. So based on that, a number of provisions that have been provided for, especially when it comes to voting abroad, which is within what we call the special voters. We've got 3 different special voters that enables the country to provide for them. So in this particular area, the legislation and the laws and the policies of the Commission are aligned with that. But on the other side, the Commission is not operating in isolation. It has now also to incorporate our international and regional obligations through the declarations, whether it's the UN or it is the AU or it is the SADC, as well as observing and incorporating the best practices from the peer groups. That's why a forum like this become relevant and important for us, is that we are also learning from other countries. In my language, they say a bird can only build its nest by borrowing from the feathers or taking the feathers of the others. So we draw from the peers in the region to enable us to evolve this particular space. What I've done is I've summarized that just in the period since 1994, what's been the evolution, because it's not a static, it evolves. In 1994, voting abroad was limited mainly to officials and diplomats. And after 1994, in 1999, it then extended to certain workers, the special workers who were out of the country temporarily, business people and so on, and students that were studying abroad, as well as, different travelers. But they had to have registered in the country to be given the right to vote. In 2004, largely nothing was touched. But in 2009, the Constitutional Court recognized the broader right of overseas citizens, because in South Africa, people really exercise their rights. We are a very litigious country, and people continue to push the envelope. So there was a teacher in London, for example, who said, no, I'm here on work. Isn't the Commission denying me my right? So that's how then it evolved, which is what you call the issue of the evolution of the jurisprudence, the judiciary, is very much central in the South African driver of these things, because people are litigious and the courts are continuously interpreting the law. So they play a very critical role. So in 2013, again, we saw that it was also the electoral law was amended to implement, where now the administration is incorporating what the judiciary has pronounced. So we saw in 2014 the first broad overseas participation. I think in the earlier presentation that was made by Mr. Abrams, he showed the cues of where we are today in the last election. That was the London mission, where people came out in large numbers. In fact, now our largest voting station is outside of the country because of that. But and this was also enabled that administratively, we also had the Electoral Commission proactively improving the ability for people to register. Once the introduction of the online registration enabled in 2019 that we could get more people now to actually come on board and vote. So we're also seeing the interchange of the technology and the electoral management body. So the technology is another driver. It opened up another frontier of easing and opening up participation and access for people, but it still was largely restricted. And so in 2024, we saw that we had 111 missions worldwide that had now been what you call opened. Now, it's not that we don't encounter issues and restrictions in this process, because even now, you're still restricted to be using only the missions abroad. This is the consulate, it's the high commissions, and the embassies. So again, our learned friends, we don't know in their silk and lovely gowns what they're going to pronounce, because as we are sitting here, there is another litigation where the commission was taken to court to say, we want now even those little symbolic offices of people that they can use those facilities for voting, you know, honorary offices and all of that. Now, the challenge kicks in, because as opposed to the international missions where you have South African officials, the honorary missions are citizens of those countries. We have no control, and some of them are working from the boot of their cars in their garage or something like that. Now, those people now have to comply with very onerous legislative requirements of the due process that's required, because no process in terms of the voting is actually different simply because you are overseas. The requirements are still the same, you know, in terms of the voting, legislative requirements and all of those things. Now, somebody in the boot of their Cadillac or their Volkswagen, and how are they going to do that? How do we have a control? And the issues of the security and all those things are arising. But we're waiting for the courts to provide, to make a ruling on that particular issue of honorary consulates. And those temporary voting stations, that can they be placed? And the materials, can the security of the materials be provided? You know, and the credibility of those results, it becomes a challenge. You know, we do face then, you know, in the process, the issues of the security of the ballot papers, like any other countries. Also availability of trained officials. We have to provide those particular people. So we send our staff members to go and help to assist with those diplomatic offices. I've already stated that the online registration has significantly made the improvements for us, and we are able to actually have across the global where our missions are seated. Now, we also have this issue, which is, in our case, it's debatable if it will ever be applicable, the postal services that other countries would utilize. In our case, I mean, I can't trust the post office now with a love letter to say, hi, I'm missing you, I'm working somewhere here in Zimbabwe, and so on and so forth. And now to trust that postal service to do it's not an option at the moment. And then the frontier we see is the frontier that we see is the electronic voting. Now, electronic voting is debatable as we stand, even in the country, let alone internationally. But it is one of the frontiers that we, as EMBs, we need to look into and see how in the unfolding future that we're headed for, will those things be considered. In conclusion, really, one can say the overall trajectory has been that of a progressive enfranchisement of the overseas voting, but it has to be pragmatic and customized to each country's circumstances and conditions. It's not something that you can cut and paste and impose on each country. Thank you, Program Director.
Thank you so much. While we have you there, you can hang on a little bit. So you have outlined quite clearly the progression from when we started having democratic voting in South Africa. What one lesson can someone pick from the process in South Africa for the other EMBs that are yet to implement? If there's one thing legal, operational, that they can learn from this?
It's a bit hard to say what single thing that one can really single out in this evolving space. But what, for me, is in my own experience as a practitioner and who's seen the window from 2019 to where we are today, both as an administrator and on the other side as a commissioner, is that the dynamism of the environment is not dependent on you as an EMB. So, as I was pointing out, that there are 3 or 4 main drivers. In each one of those drivers, you need to be responsive. You know, what does the laws of your country say and your constitution? You need to optimize your compliance. On the other side, what happens administratively? You have an obligation to make sure you deliver credible elections with integrity as a commission. So you do all that is necessary to put the required legislative environment that enables that even the overseas or out of the country people abroad can be able to be enfranchised, because disenfranchising is actually in transgression of the laws. And then thirdly is the issue that as long as you have a democratic and a judiciary system, litigations will continue to flow. So you need to evolve and be able to adapt those particular mechanisms that are coming through. You know, people are continuing and will continue to challenge the system or to demand their peculiar circumstances to be recognized in what you put as policies and practices.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you.
You can have your seat. So we are talking about a very important right to vote, but we also have a very important right to nutrition. So that we don't trample on that right, we'll take very brief questions for the panel, and then we can proceed. So we have done a very good job as a panel. Thank you very much. So when you take the mic, you just ask your question straight, okay? Thank you. We'll start this way, come back. Mr. Mvosa, and then yourself, and then you, and then Fred. Yes, you can start.
Merci beaucoup. Depuis ce matin, nos panels sont riches par rapport aux bonnes pratiques et exemples dans différents pays sur ce vote de la diaspora. Ma question est simple. De tout ce que nous avons écouté, quelle est la place des observateurs électoraux dans ce vote de la diaspora? Merci.
Thank you. Mine is not a question, but an addition to case study. Can you hear me? Okay, great, thanks. I just wanted to also highlight the case of Bangladesh, because I did hear a number of comments with regards, is it worth it? What's the cost implications of implementing diaspora vote? What Bangladesh did, and this is the election they conducted this year, they introduced what they call out-of-country voting BD app. And the uniqueness is that they basically uplifted the traditional mode of voting onto a mobile app. So it combines registration as well as voting. So you have those two elements. But it also integrates safeguards in there for one to be able to vote. But most interesting for the EMBs is that it is 100% in control of the diaspora vote. It jumps the loops of, for instance, using missions. Bangladesh was able to vote, Bangladeshi citizens were able to vote in 122 countries. So you can imagine the reach that that has. So it's basically kind of bringing that to the fore. You can have a look at it. It's called the BD app, and it cuts a lot of these issues, and it uses postal voting. And it has an interface even for observation, real-time mechanism where one is able to see who has registered at what particular point in time. Even when you're voting, it has that mechanism, and you only have to use your phone. So it's a very, very good example of how technology as well as the physical voting can be
integrated. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. I just want to start by thanking the presenters. So because of the time, I will just go straight to the question. I just want to ask Nadema Shulubu, maybe to explain a little bit in terms of how do they select countries where you conduct this diaspora voting. That is the first question. Secondly, in terms of the election observation and party agent representation, how do you deal with that? Because normally, under normal circumstances, parties want to be represented at each and every voting stations. So I just want to hear, how do you deal with this one, where you conduct voting outside the boundaries of the country, especially abroad? Because this issue of diaspora voting is one of the best practices, but in terms of logistics, other EMs have to think about that. So the questions are just the two questions. I just have two questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Fred, quickly.
Yeah, thank you very much. Mine is more of a kind of comment than a question. Flowing from the earlier presentation and now, people spoke about issue of costs, and one fundamental thing that they were making references to was the issue of trust. aversing our minds to the relevance of this kind of forum, and then the AAEA as an association. What I know is that can't we as EMB rely on the EMBs in the various countries to conduct the elections for us when it comes to overseas voting? Let me give you an example. In Ghana, we've been doing elections for Mali, Niger, and some of the Sahelian countries. What do? We, the Electoral Commission of Ghana, receive the ballot papers on their behalf. And then we conduct the elections and transmit the results to the election management bodies of the various countries that are hosting the elections. So we do the election for Mali, and we send the election results to the Malian Electoral Commission. As a network, EMB network, instead of relying on the various embassies, you can use the host country EMB to help you do this. And I think it solved the issue of trust. Because if they know that Ghana Electoral Commission is conducting the election for Malians in Ghana, of course, people will not make references to the ambassador who is an appointee of the government to rig the elections. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. We'll take this side. Is there anyone you want to pick to respond to? Okay, and then there's two that was
Sim, quero responder até porque sinto que tinha muito mais para dizer sobre este tema. O nosso painel ficou muito reduzido e era muito bom partilhar as experiências dos países que já têm. Nós temos uma experiência consolidada já. Eu percebo quando se fala, aqui já se falou muito dos custos e da confiança. É verdade. Realizar eleições fora do nosso território é oneroso, mas não pode ser uma desculpa para não se realizar e dar oportunidade de participação política dos nossos imigrantes. O imigrante não serve só para remessa financeira ao seu país, precisa também de participar. Eu vou-vos dar um exemplo. Nós realizamos eleições dos deputados à Assembleia da República no dia 17 de maio. E o partido vencedor só conseguiu a maioria absoluta porque conseguiu eleger os 2 deputados no Círculo Eleitoral da América. Nós já conseguimos eleger um presidente da República por causa do voto do estrangeiro. Portanto, é necessário essa participação política. Por outro lado, a confiança, é verdade, a confiança é fundamental, razão pela qual os partidos políticos devem estar presentes com delegados em todas as fases do processo. E não é difícil que os partidos possam ter representantes nos vários países onde é feita a eleição. Portanto, é necessária essa confiança. Um outro dado importante que foi aqui referido por nosso colega do Ghana. É fundamental, e aqui é uma lição a partilhar, que nós usemos a colaboração entre as OEG, não é? Entre os nossos órgãos de gestão eleitoral. Cabo Verde solicita a colaboração de todos os países para disponibilizar urnas, biombos. Precisamos também de colocar o nosso Ministério dos Negócios Estrangeiros como uma peça fundamental no processo eleitoral da diáspora. São eles que fazem a articulação com os governos dos países de acolhimento. Nós conseguimos realizar eleições em cerca de 22 países, em todos os continentes, utilizando como local de funcionamento, porque não se confina às embaixadas e aos postos, nós tentamos levar as assembleias o mais próximo das nossas comunidades, através da cooperação entre os nossos ministérios dos negócios estrangeiros. E esses países disponibilizam as escolas onde no seu país é feita a eleição. Portanto, é possível, é custoso, mas vale a pena. Os nossos imigrantes têm o direito, como princípio da igualdade, de participar e não só para remeter as remessas financeiras ao seu país de origem. Aqui, como seleciona os países? Naturalmente que é uma razão, já foi dito, uma razão histórica, não é? As nossas comunidades têm países para os quais vão, existem comunidades maiores ou menores e tudo isto depende de uma decisão política. Não cabe ao órgão de gestão eleitoral decidir em qual país vai realizar eleições. Tem a ver com os laços históricos e com uma opção política. Obrigada.
Thank you. Data machining. Those two.
Thank you. The first question to briefly respond to, it's the role of the observers. In our processes, all those missions are open to political parties to send an observer. And very often you find that they will ask somebody, citizen that is abroad or outside of the country, that they have comfort and confidence, then that person gets accredited as an observer. So there's no issue, there's no problem with that. And then the other part, the issue of the selection of countries, as I said, is that all countries where there is a South African mission, then the mission can be a high commissioner, could be an ambassador, it could be a consulate, or a combination of those. All of those particular missions can then be the points of voting. Where we are in court, the people want to extend it, is to say, let us also have the ceremonial category of people that I mentioned earlier on. And I said it's local citizens that may be operating from the boot of their cars or garage. That's where we draw the line, that's not the territory, because remember, legally, there's the jurisdiction of each country is where its mission is at. So we conduct it within the jurisdiction of our missions, not outside. And this makes an interesting part in that question that our colleague Fred was pointing out in terms of the debate. And I guess, as he said, this is an observation. It's something to be contemplated and to be considered. However, I think our colleague from Cape Verde has pointed out it's a political issue as well. The relations between the countries, whether you can be able to implement those things in other countries where you don't have a jurisdiction. We as EMBs have a prescribed mandate. It can't be extended to another EMB. So those are other legislative considerations that will have to come through. But I think it's something that is worthy for us as EMBs to begin to debate and to discuss as some of the options, going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Last round from this half. One. Chinedu, was your hand up? 1, 2, 3. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. I'm Joash Amopiton, the chair of Independent National Electoral Commission of Nigeria. And I'm happy and thank you for this opportunity, because you know that Nigeria is the largest democracy in Africa, population of over 200 million people, and over 100 million registered voters. And so the contribution and debate of Nigeria on this is very germane. The issue of out-of-country voting, diaspora, is very, very controversial in Nigeria, because by the Diaspora Commission of Nigeria, we have over 20 million Nigerians in diaspora, spread across various nations. So it was really enthusing to hear that you are talking of one person voting in diaspora. But you know, in case of Nigeria, definitely you'll be talking of millions of people, and you know the logistic that will be involved in conducting diaspora voting. It actually came up as part of the debate in the last electoral reform, but it was shut down for two reasons. The issues of having diaspora constituency vis-a-vis political gerrymandering, whereby it can be manipulated in favor of a particular candidate or party. It's a situation where the leaders choose their voters and not voters choosing the leaders. So those were some of the concerns, apart from the issue of cost. So I believe that this issue of diaspora voting should be addressed from the local circumstances, because you give your country people the electoral regime and process the desire at any particular point in time. But what we're discussing in here is very, very important, because most countries in Africa are about to break the jinx from what they call in quote underdevelopment to development. And our electoral process is very germane to that. And there are so many factors that are militating against this. So it is very important that this matter is well addressed to see how local fears, trust deficits are addressed, because it's very, very important. We will not be able to do it at the same time. However, taking one point here is that maybe we should begin to think of having a legal framework under the auspices of the African Union, a form of model that can be put together through a forum like this. My friend from Ghana suggested, my friend and brother from Ghana suggested EMBs and other countries organizing the diaspora voting. What of diplomatic and political considerations that comes with that? For instance, Ghana and Nigeria. If we ask Ghana EMB to conduct for Nigerians there, people would think Nigerian president and Ghana, they are friends. So there could be a lot of things. So maybe because of time, legal framework, a model emerging from here and at various levels for country to develop at their space. Thank you.
Thank you. There were two of you first, DRC first, and then Kenya finally.
Merci beaucoup. Je m'appelle Dave Banza. Je suis le directeur de cabinet adjoint de la Commission électorale nationale de la RDC. Ma première question s'adresse à l'intervenant qui l'expérience de Tunisie. Alors, la première question, c'est la suivante. Peut-être que j'ai bien noté. Il a souligné que 185 places ont été disponibilisées par le pays d'accueil. Alors, la question, est-ce que ces 185 places, c'est y compris aussi les missions diplomatiques ou bien c'est en dehors des missions diplomatiques? Ça, c'est la sous-question. Et la deuxième sous-question, que prévoit la législation électorale tunisienne par rapport au lieu d'implantation de bureaux de vote? La deuxième question par rapport à l'expérience sud-africaine. C'est presque dans la même façon, mais il y a trois choses qui m'intéressent. En 2024, 111 missions ont été ouvertes. Afrique du Sud, je crois que c'est ça, en 2024. L'affirmation, si c'est exact, je voulais savoir, est-ce que ce sont les bureaux de vote ou ce sont des représentations secondaires, temporaires ou des représentations permanentes? La sous-question pour l'Afrique du Sud, est-ce qu'il peut nous préciser exactement comment se fait réellement chez eux l'enregistrement en ligne? Parce qu'il a affirmé que l'enregistrement en ligne a apporté des grandes améliorations en termes d'organisation électorale. Est-ce qu'il peut nous préciser ou contextualiser comment ils font l'enregistrement en ligne? Et la dernière question à l'Afrique du Sud, comment est organisé les contentieux du vote de la diaspora? Nous sommes intéressés vraiment à cette question. Comment est organisé le contentieux du vote de la diaspora? Expérience sud-africaine. Merci.
Thank you. Kenya, very quickly. Your 1 minute runs concurrently. Hey?
Thank you so much. You limited me to one minute. My name is Abdi Maalim. I'm the Director of Electoral Operations from Kenya. I like these sessions and the presentations this morning and experience sharing. As we expanded diaspora voter registration, one challenge we had that was mentioned by Tunisia and came up is the time zones. And I liked the idea of the 72 hours. Probably, I wanted to know from Tunisia whether the 72 hours are based on the Tunisian time or the local time, because one of the challenges that we had in 2022 as we expanded towards West was the time differences. Even in America, where we had 3 missions, the time difference between New York and LA was monumentous and had a lot of challenges on us. The 72 hours, is it based on the local time or it's based on the Tunisian time? The local time, in this case, the diaspora. Secondly, is that 72 hours something that is exclusive for the diaspora or as well as the locals? Thank you so much.
Thank you. You can take the 3 questions, sir, and then... Tata Mashinini, you can proceed while they fix.
شكرا. إجابة على زميلي من الكونغو، بالنسبة للفضاءات الممنوحة، هي في الواقع ممنوحة من الدول الاعتماد التي نقيم لديها هذه الانتخابات. وهذه الفضاءات يمكن أن تكون معناتها من عدة يعني جهات كما المجتمع المدني، كما يعني فضاءات ثقافية، يعني مش بالضرورة كلها يعني التمثيليات القنصلية أو السفارات الدبلوماسية التونسية. هي في الواقع تكون فضاءات عامة أو يعني من عدة جهات في البلد الاعتماد، لكن يكون بالموافقة متاع بطبيعة السلطات المحلية ولتأمين إذن الانتخابات فيها وتكون تسير الأمور على أحسن ما يرام فيها. بالنسبة للسؤال الثاني لو سمحت si vous permettez, pourriez-vous répéter la question? J'ai mal saisi. Votre deuxième question. Voulez-vous...
Que prévoit la législation tunisienne par rapport à l'implantation des bureaux de vote à l'extérieur dans la diaspora?
Oui, évidemment, pour les bureaux de vote à l'extérieur, ils sont régis par la même loi électorale, par les mêmes dispositions réglementaires que ceux qui sont à l'intérieur du pays. C'est-à-dire qu'ils sont contrôlés, gérés et régis par les mêmes dispositions donc, réglementaires tunisiennes, aussi bien à l'intérieur qu'à l'extérieur. Je ne sais pas si j'ai bien répondu à votre question, mais nous les contrôlons, exactement, ils sont traités de la même façon qu'un bureau à l'intérieur du pays. Bien évidemment, les élections à l'extérieur, les Tunisiens résidant à l'extérieur n'ont droit ne peuvent participer qu'à des élections générales, c'est-à-dire présidentielles ou législatives. Ils n'ont pas, bien évidemment, droit au vote pendant les élections locales, municipales ou régionales. Voilà donc pour votre deuxième question. Je ne sais pas s'il y a une autre question concernant...
No, it was just that, and if the 72 hours is local time or international time, so it's fine.
Thank you, Program Director. Let me start with the last question regarding the abroad or overseas, out of the country voter dispute resolution question. All disputes are processed through the political parties. We have a standing structural political liaison committee at all levels in our country, at national level, at provincial level, and at local level. And during national elections, which affect out of the country voting, the national and provincial level dispute resolution mechanisms under the auspices of our PLC, political liaison committees, are continuously engaged. So observers or party agents that would have been assigned in polling station or VDs anywhere in the world are in touch with those political parties that would have deployed them, and through that particular channel, those disputes are resolved. Incidentally, the South African legislation provides that the Electoral Commission cannot announce the results while there still are objections or to be addressed. So you have to exhaust all objections first before you can announce the election results. So the mechanism is there, it provides for that. And then there was also the question of the online registration. And we now have that mechanism, whether you're in the country or you're outside. And this has enabled us, in fact, in the last 2 weeks, we had the largest registration drive because we do 2 registration weekends before every election. The largest was in the last 2 weeks, because this has enabled that students, youngsters, and anybody can now go online and put their details and register and update their details. We don't have to have a registration weekend. It is supplemented by the online registration. So this has become now a much more accessible. People don't have to wait to physically go to our missions anyway, but they can just do it online, and their details are on board. And then there was the issue of the breakdown of the 110 or so voting districts. As I pointed out, at the moment, our laws only provide that we can have voting stations, which we call VD, voting district, only where there is a South African official mission. Now, there are 2 categories that are official. One, it is high commissioners and embassies. Then the other category is the consulates. So the consulate, let's take for example in the US, you've got Washington as our embassy. But you've got consulates in New York, and with consulate in LA, and so on and so forth. So it is where there are consulates that we would open anything. So that was the thing. The last comment is really to, which for me was probably a comment from the colleague from Josh from Nigeria. And I share with you, Chair, that it definitely, you know, you can never have a one shoe fits all. But at the same time, you can't avoid the issue of enfranchisement of people because of numbers or so on and so forth. The challenge for us as the EMBs is we must strive to find ways to extend that in as practical and pragmatic way as possible. Thank you.
Alô. Eu gostaria também de comentar aquilo que o colega da Nigéria referiu. Eu penso que esta questão não tem a ver com números. Desculpe contrariar, apesar de ser a maior democracia, não tem. Sabe porquê? Porque independentemente da dimensão, as dificuldades serão as mesmas, de logística, de organização. Portanto, não é uma questão de número. Mais uma vez, é uma questão de vontade e de respeitar a nossa Carta de Direitos Humanos. Em segundo lugar, eu gostaria de dizer que um modelo, não me parece que o caminho para um modelo comum vá servir aos vários países. Seria mais um guia de boas práticas e deixar que cada país desenvolva o seu modelo em função da sua realidade, adaptando à sua realidade. Portanto, nós estamos em querer, e digo isso, nós somos um país pequeno, mas já contamos com 31 anos de experiência nessa matéria. Portanto, seria bom que houvesse boas práticas, um guia de boas práticas e não um modelo comum. Portanto, tudo depende da vontade política de integrar, de fazer eleições inclusivas. Muito obrigada.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much to the panel. Thank you to everyone. And I think the key words that we can take out from the conversations that we have, cost came out quite a lot. The issue of trust came out quite a lot, and we spoke about that even when we are talking about introducing technology, postal voting, and the works. Collaboration came out quite a lot as well, but most importantly is customization of the issues. So in as much as we all would want to grant our citizens the right to vote, we have to customize it. What is working in Cape Verde might not necessarily be implemented in Nigeria, if we take the last example. But we must all work towards enabling our citizens out of the country to vote. So once again, thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you very much to all of us.
Please, from here, we're going to lunch. And we're having our lunch at where you had the breakfast. The key component that you need to have your lunch is your badge. You have your badge. So, please, if you don't have your badge, look inside your bag, especially the AKS bag that was given, the African Union bag. You must have your badge in there. From lunch, we are to return here exactly 3 o'clock. 3 o'clock. We have to return here 3 o'clock. So please, you have almost 2 hours for lunch to stretch. Oh, sorry, you have 1 hour, sorry. I think I'm taking Ghana time, sorry. It's not jollof rice time, please. We have 1 hour to return here. Thank you very much. Please, if you don't have your badge, I need to follow you up and then make sure that you go through security. Thank you. Bye.